My name is Sue Park-Hur. I just turned 53 and I was born in Seoul, Korea. My father was 17 when the Korean War broke out. I found out he was based at the on an island closest to the border. And so imagine a 17-year-old kid in this very, very scary place. And I think now looking back, he just froze. My uncles used to call him Buddha because he was so quiet after he had served the war. He had auditory voice that was telling him what to do, and he had a breakdown. And so he couldn't keep a job. And so that's why he was inside the house so long. And I think, and again, we didn't have the words, right? We didn't have the word PTSD. And so my mom was working, so she was outside, and my grandmother also lived with us. And we lived in the sub-basement of this house because my mom is the only one who was working. You know, you come with that American dream. My parents came with the American dream to start all over, as they had hauntings in Korea that they were trying to run away from of my dad's mental illness. But there's also hauntings here too, you know, on this land, in this country. They have to face racism. Maybe I could kind of navigate and quickly adjust and adapt. You know, your parents can't, right? They're limited with the economic options of looking for a job. And it's so hard when you have this image of America and then the reality of immigrant life with very little resource and education is very different. And of course, as a 1.5 generation child of an immigrant, your job is to really just make sure that you do a good job. And I did well in school. And then I went to college. And while on the weekends, you're helping your parents at the store. In 1992, I was a sophomore in college and I was at UCLA. And then we saw what was happening with Rodney King. And all of a sudden, all of these things got meshed up when everything broke out, which didn't make sense to me. Instead of shifting from the police brutality and the verdict of that, it shifted. The whole narrative of the media shifted to the Korean Black community conflict. And so my dad somehow got a gun and is on top of the store, just like when we see all these images of these men with guns on top of buildings. And that's when I realized, oh my goodness, my dad actually knows how to use a gun. And oh my goodness, because they all went through military training in Korea, right? And all these men on top, they're not joking. They know how to use a gun, right? And so there was real deep-seated trauma that had unsurfaced that was formative to recognize that racism isn't just saying bad things to each other. Racism is really a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. And that's what I started recognizing. What does it mean to reconcile? How does that look like in our families? Because we see so much violence in the way that we talk to each other in our families. Why does that happen? And so we have to look at the historical issues. And it's like, we have this violent past. What does that look like in our churches? Because we should have some common language. What is our theology? And then what does it look like in our communities, us nationally? Like where are areas that we need to speak into? And then what does that look like even maybe back in our motherland? Maybe things that we can do that other people in Korea cannot do. For example, North Korea. So my husband and I, after we had planted churches and been served in churches, decided to start a peace center called ReconciliAsian. And what we are trying to do is to help equip our communities and our churches to think theologically, and then to also practice some skills like conflict transformation, restorative justice, trauma healing, resilience building, and this continual work of how is it embodied? How does it show up? And who are the people who are doing this work? How do we talk about our brokenness? Because if we don't talk and tend to our wounds, we will despise wounded people, right? If we don't address our own hurt, we will hurt other people, right? And so the importance of that work of healing to tend to our wounds and our hurt is essential because it ripples out. A very life-changing moment was my mom passing when I was 16 years old. A couple of years ago when I turned 50, or building up to that, was a very important time for me because I was thinking, I'm going to be older than my mom. How do I live being older than my mom? She used to have little diaries that I didn't open until I turned 49, until I turned about 50. Because I just, first of all, I can't really read Korean handwriting. And then I realized I need to. And I realized that the narrative that I had of my mom, her painful story of immigration, like, you start forming pictures and stories of your parent. And I was looking through that and I saw that, like, she goes, date with my husband, Astro something restaurant in Korea. Or like the day that I was born, I was like looking at the thing and she's like, somebody brought me bananas. Like, I just saw her as a person who's beyond the trauma that I have shaped her into my life to be. Like, she died tragically before she was 50. Like, that was my story of my mom. Like, she sacrificed everything and then she died early and she didn't get to see a lot of fruits of her labor, right? But I realized, oh my gosh, she was a human. She was like a young giddy girl who was excited about going on a date with her husband, right? Or that she was happy that she received gifts. Befriending my mom, even though she's no longer here, has been an interesting journey, and the importance of reshaping my narrative to not get stuck in the stories that I have of people, dead or alive, right? That I don't know the full story, and that I need to continue to be curious about other people's stories and to learn from them instead of going, oh, I figured you out. Like, oh, you came at a certain time. You're from this area. Like, you studied here. Like, I got you. No way. I know a glimpse of it. Even my dad's story. I couldn't tell people. I could hardly breathe when my dad had his episodes, right? Um, and it was so shameful that I couldn't even tell my friends about his mental health and how that impacted me. When I talk to my children about it as I am healing about and I wasn't sure if my children would understand their grandfather that they barely met because he passed, pretty early in their life. Would they be able to understand? And can I honor him even with the painful stories that I have of him, right? My kids, when I told them very carefully, they're like, well, of course he would have mental health issues. He just went through of course that makes sense to them. And I'm like, wow, we often talk about trauma that's not transformed, is transferred. And I'm like, oh, there's been some transformation. Like, they're going to tell that story differently than the way that I've held it, right? And it's still true, but they won't have all the trauma that I had of telling that story. So my father died of lung cancer. There was this moment when I was sitting with him and my dad said, 성희야, my Korean name, said, 나 때문에 고생했다. That means you've suffered because of me. It was just like the soft spoken, he's just like, 성희야, 나 때문에 고생했다. And then I just said, I thought of it for a minute because I've had such complicated, when my mom died, I said, God, why didn't you take my dad? Like, why did you have to take my mom? And I had that anger and grief, right? And, but at that moment, now I'm a mother. I'm a mother of 2 children, little ones. And I told my dad, I said, Dad, yeah, there were a lot of moments when it was hard. But now I realize you tried your best. You could have been violent with us. You could have been but you weren't. Or you tried. I see that you've tried your best with what you've been given. So it doesn't hurt anymore. And then I remember squeezing my dad's hand and there was reconciliation. I mean, for him to say what he said was so bold. I was sharing the gospel with my dad. And my dad said, for the first time, I hear what you're saying. And that was everything, I think that reconciliation that we had of naming the truth and the pain that we've been holding and to let that go, it allowed him to be released to hear and be something beyond. Because it's not like he didn't know the pain that he had inflicted on our family. But it was so brave of him to say what he did. And for me to have the chance to say, it's okay. I've forgiven you long time ago. And as an adult, again, me growing up now, like I'm grown, right? To say, I recognize that you tried. It's so hard to raise kids. And in spite of all of that, you've tried. And that was enough. That's why I could do the work that I do, because I've experienced it. Yeah. Because I know the power of it. Yeah. It's not just a good idea. It's life-changing. My name is Sue Park-Hur, and this is my Korean American story.